Do you always leave the door unlocked when you're naked, or is this a special invitation? The voice startled me, slicing through the rhythmic sound of water, cascading against the shower tiles. My heart leaped to my throat as I froze mid-lather, the soapy suds sliding down my chest in slow rivulets. Turning sharply, I saw him, Adrian, my roommate, standing in the doorway, his face a mixture of amusement and something else I couldn't quite place. "What the hell, Adrian?" I snapped, my voice breaking somewhere between shock and irritation. My hands fumbled for the shower curtain, yanking it closed with a force that sent droplets of water flying. "Relax. It's not like I haven't seen a guy naked before," he quipped, but his eyes lingered a moment too long before he turned and walked away, leaving the door ajar. The encounter shouldn't have meant anything. We'd shared this apartment for over a year now, and Adrian had always been, well, Adrian, confident, charming, and infuriatingly self-assured. He had a way of walking into a room that made you feel both invisible and exposed, like he saw through the layers you worked so hard to keep intact. I stood there under the hot spray of water, my mind racing as my pulse refused to settle. It wasn't just the embarrassment of being caught in such a vulnerable state. It was the way he looked at me, not with pity or indifference, but with a smirk that hinted at something far more dangerous. Adrian and I weren't friends in the traditional sense. We were more like two planets orbiting the same sun, coexisting in a space that was equal parts comfortable and distant. I worked long hours as a graphic designer, often retreating to my room with my laptop and noise-canceling headphones. Adrian, on the other hand, was the social one. A bartender by trade, he was always hosting late-night gatherings or disappearing for days with one of his many friends. Our schedules rarely aligned, which was probably why we managed to live together without stepping on each other's toes. Until now, that morning had started like any other. I'd woken up groggy, the weight of deadlines looming over me like a storm cloud. The apartment was quiet, a rarity given Adrian's nocturnal lifestyle. I assumed he was out, probably at the gym or nursing a hangover at a cafe downtown. The bathroom was my sanctuary, the one place where I felt truly alone. I stepped into the shower, letting the heat of the water melt away the stress clinging to my muscles. My thoughts drifted as they often did, floating between work and the half-finished novel I swore I'd write someday. And then he walked in. By the time I stepped out of the shower, towel wrapped tightly around my waist, the air in the apartment felt charged, like the aftermath of a thunderstorm. Adrian was in the kitchen, leaning casually against the counter with a mug of coffee in hand. He didn't look up as I approached, but I could feel his attention shift. "You could have knocked," I said, my voice sharper than intended. He smirked, finally meeting my gaze. "I could have, but where's the fun in that?" I rolled my eyes, clutching the towel tighter as I tried to sidestep him. "You're unbelievable." "And you're uptight," he shot back, his tone playful but pointed. "It's just skin, mate. Nothing I haven't seen before." The way he said it made my stomach flip, and I hated that I couldn't tell if it was out of irritation or something else. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the moment lingered, replaying in my mind like a song stuck on repeat. There was an unspoken tension now, a shift in the air that neither of us acknowledged. Later that evening, as I sat on the couch pretending to watch a documentary, Adrian walked in, a fresh beer in hand. He flopped down beside me, his presence too close for comfort. "You've been quiet today," he said, glancing at me from the corner of his eye. "Just busy," I replied, keeping my gaze fixed on the screen. "Right." He took a sip of his beer, his lips curling into that infuriating smirk again. "For what it's worth, I wasn't trying to freak you out this morning." "You didn't," I lied, my cheeks flushing despite myself. "Good." His voice softened, losing its usual edge. "Because I'd hate for you to think I don't respect boundaries." The words hung between us, heavy with implication. I wanted to say something, to push back or defuse the moment, but the truth was, I didn't know how. And that's when I realized the problem wasn't just Adrian. It was me. Did you want me to apologize? Or are you waiting for me to do it again? Adrian's voice cut through the quiet, low and deliberate, as if he'd been rehearsing the line all evening. I looked up from my laptop, startled to find him leaning against the doorway to my room. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes carried the same disarming intensity that had been haunting me since the morning's incident. "What are you even talking about?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. "You've been weird all day," he said, stepping into the room. He closed the door behind him, a gesture that felt deliberate, as though he was trying to trap the energy building between us. "If I cross a line, just say so. But something tells me that's not what's really bothering you." I sighed, closing my laptop and leaning back in my chair. "You have a habit of overanalyzing everything. You know that." "Maybe." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of my bed, his presence filling the small space. "Or maybe I just have a habit of noticing things other people don't." I opened my mouth to retort, but no words came. He wasn't wrong. Adrian had always been perceptive in a way that made me uncomfortable. He had this knack for seeing through the walls I built, dismantling them brick by brick with nothing more than a glance or a well-timed comment. The silence stretched, thick and charged, until he finally broke it. "Can I ask you something?" I hesitated but nodded. "Why did you look at me like that this morning?" The question hit me like a slap, my pulse quickening as I replayed the moment in my mind. I had looked at him, hadn't I? Really looked. And in that brief, unguarded second, I'd let something slip, something I couldn't take back. "I don't know what you mean," I said, though my voice betrayed me. Adrian tilted his head, studying me like a puzzle he was determined to solve. "Yeah, you do." I stood abruptly, the need to escape overwhelming. "This is ridiculous. You walked in on me, Adrian. I was embarrassed, that's all." "Embarrassed?" He stood too, closing the distance between us in 2 quick strides. "Is that really it? Because if it is, I'll back off. But if it's not..." He trailed off, leaving the rest of the sentence hanging in the air between us. I hated how exposed I felt under his gaze, like he could see every thought racing through my mind. But there was no denying the pull, the gravitational force that had been quietly drawing me toward him since the day we met. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm tired of pretending there's nothing here," he said, his tone raw and unguarded. "Aren't you?" His words landed like a punch to the chest, knocking the air from my lungs. He was right. Of course he was. But admitting it felt like stepping off a cliff, uncertain if there was solid ground below. "Adrian," I started, but he cut me off. "Just be honest with me, Milo. For once, stop hiding." Hearing my name on his lips, spoken with such urgency, broke something inside me. The walls I'd spent years building crumbled, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. "I can't," I said, shaking my head. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" he pressed, his voice softening. "What are you so afraid of?" I didn't have an answer, at least not one that made sense. The truth was, I wasn't afraid of him. I was afraid of what he made me feel, of the way he turned my carefully ordered life upside down, with nothing more than a look or a touch. Before I could stop myself, I stepped closer, the gap between us shrinking until there was nowhere left to run. He didn't move, didn't speak, just waited with a patience that felt like both a challenge and an invitation. And then I kissed him. It wasn't planned or graceful. It was messy and desperate, all teeth and lips and unspoken emotions spilling out in one chaotic rush. But it was real. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the stillness. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that," he murmured, his voice laced with relief. I let out a shaky laugh, my hands still tangled in the fabric of his shirt. "You're infuriating, you know that?" "Yeah," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. "But you like it." I couldn't argue with that. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't pretending. And as terrifying as it was, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Still, the weight of what we'd just done loomed in the back of my mind, a reminder that the road ahead would be anything but simple. "I have a boyfriend," Adrian said, his voice low and hesitant, as if testing the weight of the words in the air between us. The confession hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of my chest. All the passion, the chaos of the kiss, suddenly seemed so fragile in the face of this reality. Adrian wasn't just my roommate anymore. He was someone else's partner, someone else's person. I stepped back, my mind reeling. "Wait, what? Since when?" His face tightened, guilt flickering in his eyes. "For a few months now." You've never really asked about my personal life, Milo." I stared at him, heart pounding in my ears. The realization clawed at me. He hadn't hidden it from me because he was trying to keep secrets. He had kept it hidden because we'd never talked about things that mattered, like feelings or relationships. It was always easy to pretend there were no deeper layers. But now, it was all so much harder to ignore. "I didn't know," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "I didn't know you were seeing someone." Adrian's gaze softened. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never meant for things to get complicated between us." But his voice trailed off, and I could hear the unspoken words hanging in the silence. "But I felt something for you, too." The room seemed to shrink as the weight of it all settled in. My feelings, his feelings, the betrayal. What was I supposed to do with this knowledge? How could we go back to what we had before? How could I live with myself if I kept going down this path? The emotional fallout came swiftly and violently, crashing into both of us like a tidal wave we never saw coming. For hours, neither of us spoke, the distance between us growing with each passing minute. We both knew what had just happened, what we had just allowed to happen, and yet we were stuck in a limbo of guilt and desire. I couldn't look at Adrian without seeing the face of the person he was with, the person I was, in some twisted way, betraying. I could hear his voice in my head. The person Adrian had promised himself to, someone who had no idea how close we were getting. How could I justify this? How could he? But then, the pull of attraction, of raw, untamed desire, was undeniable. Every part of me wanted to reach out to Adrian again, to pick up where we left off, to ignore the consequences and just embrace the moment. But I couldn't. I couldn't ignore the fact that we were both bound to someone else. Adrian, too, seemed lost in his thoughts. His eyes avoided mine, and his fingers fidgeted nervously as he stared at the floor. I could feel the battle raging inside him, just as it was within me. "Do you think we can just forget this happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, afraid to hear the answer. "I don't know," he said, his voice hoarse, strained. "I wish I could, but I can't stop thinking about you." And that was the moment the full weight of our situation hit me. It wasn't just about a kiss or a fleeting attraction. This was about two people who had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed, and the consequences would ripple out far beyond us. The next morning, the air between us was thick with uncertainty. I had barely slept, tossing and turning as I wrestled with the guilt and confusion. Adrian, too, seemed distant, his usual charm replaced with an awkwardness that made the apartment feel colder. I couldn't stay here. Not like this. Not with the ghost of everything we hadn't said hanging between us. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I asked him to sit down and talk, really talk, without distractions or evasions. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Adrian looked at me, his face serious, no trace of his usual cocky smile. We figured out. We can't just ignore this, I said, shaking my head. We need to be honest with ourselves. And with the people we're involved with. He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of my words. I don't want to hurt anyone, Milo, least of all him, but I also don't want to live in denial. For a long moment, there was only silence between us. Finally, Adrian spoke again, his voice quieter. I need to talk to him. Be honest. And I'll let you know what happens after that. But whatever comes next, I need to do it right. No more running from the truth. I let out a shaky breath, feeling a sense of resolve settle within me. I'll do the same. No more pretending. No more avoiding it. We didn't have all the answers, and we both knew there were difficult conversations ahead. But at least we were starting with honesty. In that moment, we found a fragile kind of peace. Not in the choices we'd made, but in the decision to move forward with integrity. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't clean, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was finally stepping into the truth of who I was. No more hiding, no more guilt. Whatever the outcome, we had to face it. Together. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you liked the story.